Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's virtual seminar. I'm really delighted to welcome Paul Levine, Professor Paul Levine from the University of Surrey to give today's talk. Paul's going to talk to us about monetary policy mandates as a topic. So this is obviously a very hot issue right now in the world of central banking. We had the Fed kind of moving to its new average inflation targeting for framework back last year. And then you'll also have seen the ECB moving to a new or tweaking its monetary policy framework earlier this year as well. So this is kind of an issue that a lot of attention is being focused on. We'll adopt the usual kind of format for the event. So if you have questions while Paul is talking, please post them in the Q&A box and I will kind of relay them to him, but we'll also leave some time for discussion at the end. Hope that all sounds okay. Paul, over to you.
Okay. Okay, let me start and let me, first of all, go through the roadmap, which you can see on the left. First of all, the paper is with a couple of my co-authors. Son Pham here was a PhD student, and actually much of the content of this seminar was part of that thesis. Sabosh Diak was at Surrey as a research officer, and he's now at the University of Exeter. So, okay, let me then just go through the roadmap. Well, I'm going to start by talking about some general principles for the conduct of monetary policy, and then the mandate framework that will implement these principles. And then there's a number of strands of literature I want to mention, and that I draw upon in this paper, in this presentation. And then the model, which is a well-known workhorse model, if you like, the Smets-Velter 2007 DSG-NK model. And then we come to really the important part of the paper, which is this idea of simple, optimized, welfare optimal rules. And then I'll go on to the what I call the delegation game. And there's going to be two delegation games, and there's not much point in dwelling on that until we come to it. And then the conclusions. So let me okay, let me move these pictures and let me talk about the conduct of monetary policy and general principles. And the first bullet point here stresses the expectational channel for policy, for any policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, macroprudential policy, any macroeconomic policy works through the expectational channel. And this is particularly true of models of the rational expectations, and especially true, but it also applies to many behavioral approaches where you have a mixture of agents who are rational and those who are behavioral. So credibility stresses the importance of accountability, and accountability through transparency. So transparency is what's emphasized when it comes to commitment rules. And hence, this leads on to the case and the need for simple objectives, which are phrased in terms of objective functions, in terms that involve bliss points, if you like, and also rules that, and simple objectives that involve simple in the sense there are a small number of target variables in the objective function. But simplicity also applies to targets in the rules themselves. So what a feature of this paper is that I stress the importance of simplicity in objectives and simplicity in rules, and that these should match each other. So matching rules to objectives is central to the paper. So that's so those are the general ideas. And the monetary policy framework that will implement these principles consists of the following 5 components. First of all, we have a simple quadratic loss function. I mean, typically, you know the NK model with a loss function in the output gap and inflation. That's an example of a simple quadratic loss function. So it penalizes deviations of target variables, normally about their steady state or about some target outcomes. And then what's special about this framework, we have matching forms of Taylor-type rules. In the case of monetary policy, these are going to be nominal interest rate rules that respond to the same target variables. Okay. The next component is in the design of these rules. It's actually very easy to construct optimized rules that perform very well. But if you look at them closely, it turns out that they involve a very aggressive response to inflation and a huge variance of the interest rate. So in other words, there's going to be a very large probability of hitting the zero lower bound. So the third component is to prevent that by imposing a zero lower bound constraint on the nominal interest rate. And the form this takes is an unconditional probability of zero lower bound episodes. So we're going to design a rule that, for instance, imposes the zero lower bound with a probability of 0.01, in other words, or 0.05, say. In other words, those are the small probabilities of hitting the zero lower bound episodes. That's the third component. The fourth component is going to be a steady state inflation target. And this is a long run inflation target. And this is going to be related actually to the zero lower bound constraint, because one way of reducing the probability of hitting the zero lower bound is to have a larger long run inflation target. And finally, given this framework, we have an instrument independent central bank that's going to be free to choose its Taylor type rule. In other words, the strength of its responses to targets that are specified in the rule. So those are the 5 components of the mandate. I don't want to get bogged down with questions, but any sort of quick question on fact, if we have any at this point. If not,
I think you're good to go.
Okay, so let me talk about the literature and the strands of literature that I bring together in this paper. Now, first of all, there's an old literature on delegation, and to this is actually missing to another authority that addresses the inefficiency of a time-consistent outcome, or also will address the inefficiency of an uncooperative equilibrium. So that's an old literature and it goes back to Rogoff and the delegation to conservative bankers and the delegation as a means of resolving the cooperation problem. Then the zero lower bound, there are a number of recent papers that Woodford talks about this quite a lot in his book. I've written about this in a more recent paper. And we're going to use in our paper a penalty function approach to this from Denham and Wind. Trend inflation. Until quite recent, until 2014, until Ascari came along, it was fairly typical to look at the workhorse linear NK model, which is linearized around a zero net inflation steady state. Now, an important paper by Ascari, this is a more recent version, showed that this is a very restrictive assumption, and the properties of these models do change quite dramatically when you introduce the trend inflation in the model. And in fact, the trend inflation is going to be important for imposing the zero lower bound, as I've mentioned. Then simple rules. Now, there's an old literature on this, on assignment of instruments and targets. This goes right back to a series of workshops I had with Martin Wheeler, I hope who's out there. I've got very fond memories of these meetings with Martin and one of his colleagues in particular, the James Mead, the wonderful James Mead, who pioneered this idea of assigning instruments and targets. And this goes back to Mundell and Vines et al., who's one of the Cambridge group. That's an old literature on assignment of instruments and targets. Here we retain the case for simplicity and simple rules, but the rationale is rather different. There's a literature now on make-up strategies which stress the importance of interest rate rules that feed back on past deviations of your target, of your outcome, inflation outcome from its target. Now, these are no more, no less than interest rate rules with persistence, and I'll explain that as we go on. There's also literature on the benefits of price level targeting rather than inflation targeting. And all those come together in these papers, and there are other papers as well. So my literature then brings together these 5 strands. So let me go on to the model. Let me so keep an eye on how I'm doing. The model is based on the Smets-Wouter 2007, which in turn goes back to 2003, which in turn goes back to Christiana et al. It's about 5 or 10 years earlier. And it's basically has these characteristics. It has at its core a real business cycle model with King-Prosser-Rubella preferences consistent with a balanced growth, non-stochastic steady state. It has both capital and labor as factors of production. With regard to capital, there are adjustment costs of investment introduced to reproduce some stylized facts in the data. There's a production function with exogenous fixed costs. We also have variable capacity utilization. That should read variable capacity utilization. Okay, those are the features of the RBC model. Now, how do we turn this into a new Keynesian model? What are the Keynesian effects, the Keynesian properties that will do that? Well, we introduce sticky prices and sticky wages. And these are modeled as the familiar Calvo contracts, where some firms in the retail sector are locked into contracts and others are, with a particular probability, are allowed to redesign their contracts. So these are Calvo contracts in both prices and wages. There's also indexing at the point where contracts are designed. So these are the main features of the model. And then to close the model, we need a monetary rule, and we're going to choose a particular type of Taylor rule, so-called implementable rule. I'll explain that when I come to the slides on this. And it's going to have a particular long-run non-zero net inflation target. And there's going to be policy inertia, which is basically this make-up strategy aspect. Okay, those are the models. That's sort of the model. And it's going to be driven by exogenous AR1 processes. There's going to be 7 of these, and I've listed them here. These are all standard. And to match those 7 exogenous processes, we're going to have 7 data series in our Bayesian estimation. And this is actually related to a question of invertibility that I'm going to come on to in due course. So, okay, that's the model. Let me briefly talk about some departures from Smets and Wouters. I mean, one is the use of aggregators to aggregate over the differentiated goods, and also to aggregate over labor types. The 2 ways of doing this, the standard, more straightforward one is Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator. More recently, Kimball aggregators have been introduced to introduce a form of it's a real inertia in the model. but there are problems with this. So they only work with an implausibly large superelasticity. I've written a paper about this. So if we have a plausible superelasticity, this is the elasticity of the elasticity in these in aggregate demand, then they have very little effect. So I've stuck with the Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator. And then there's a point about the way indexing is treated. I'll leave you to read the paper on that. Also a point about the precise nature of the AR1 shocks. Smets vow to assume armor shocks for two of the shocks, but in fact the results are not sensitive to this. The point I would like to emphasize is that we do estimate through to the zero lower bound period. So we do cover the post-2008 period. So from 2008 onwards, we use a shadow interest rate to replace the Fed rate, because this is going to be US data from 2009 onwards. The idea of this is to summarize the effects of unconventional policy and private sector interest rates. So we can use when we come to estimate the model, we can allow our interest rate rule to drift into an area where the interest rate, where the shadow interest rate is negative. But when it comes to design the actual interest rate rule, we impose a zero lower bound. So those are the departures from the Smets and Valters model. There are 42 people here. Oh, that's huge. Okay, let me now talk about. Okay, let me come to one of the key ideas and themes of the paper. Simple rules in macroeconomic policy. I've mentioned the assignment problem. I've talked about the case for simplicity. I should say at this point that we can design optimal policies not simply in terms of optimized simple rules, but in terms of the Ramsey problem, where you're not constrained to simple rules. Here, optimal policy is designed to maximize expected intertemporal welfare, household welfare. The problem with the Ramsey rule is that it leads to a very complicated rule. It's far from transparent. It's not easy to implement. And the complications involved here indeed form one of the motivations for looking at simple rules. So this contrasts with optimized simple rules. I'm going back to some of the literature I've already mentioned. And let me just reiterate why simplicity. It's easy to implement. It helps to commit. Commitment then leads to credibility and the solution to the timing consistency problem, which I'm going to mention. Another feature of simple rules, which actually we discovered going back to those halcyon days in Cambridge in 1983 with Martin, simple rules have good robustness properties. We actually show this in a separate paper. So that's so reiterating some points and literature made about simple rules, but emphasizing the gains from simplicity for rules. Let me just say one thing about the Ramsey problem. We're going to construct optimized simple rules. And in fact, it turns out, and this is a well-known feature of optimized simple rules, and this goes back to work by Schmidt, Grower, and Uribe, and in fact, work I did many years ago. The optimized simple rules can closely mimic the Ramsey problem, but they don't have the complication that they of the rules implied by the Ramsey problem. So let me continue with this theme of simple rules. Now, here I want to talk about two different types of Taylor rules. And I'm going to emphasize the need for a so-called implementable form of the rule. Now, down here you can see the notation I've used. Rn is the gross interest rate. All rates are gross. Inflation is the gross inflation rate, which is the rate of change of prices. Y is output. And the rule is going to be expressed as a log linear rule in the nominal interest rate, expressed in terms of deviations about the steady state, every time you see a variable without a subscript, it refers to the steady state. So these are all expressed in terms of the variables relative to their steady state. And this is an implementable rule, which would contrast with the Taylor type rule, which would feed back not an output relative to its steady state, but an output on the output gap. In other words, output relative to the flexi price form of the model, to the notional flexi price, the state of the economy that would appertain if prices and wages were flexible. Now, this is easy to implement because you don't need knowledge of the output gap. You don't need knowledge of the flexi price. So it's an easier rational expectations equilibrium, if you like. And this is the point I make here in the last bullet point. So that's the form of the rule. Now we're going to seek a welfare-optimized simple rule, because I'll show you the welfare criteria in just a couple of slides. Within it, but it's going to be restricted to a particular chosen family of interest rate rules. And let me just go back to here and let me reparameterize the rule in this form. So here we can allow the feedback, the persistence parameter, which must lie between 0 and 1, by the way, to actually be equal to 1. So this allows for the possibility of an integral rule. And you can see I've reparameterized alpha pi as this thing times that thing, and so on. So it's quite evident how I've reparameterized the rule. So we can have an integral rule, as I've just mentioned, but in particular, we can have another special interesting type of rule where if we suppress the output terms, we're left with a rule that only involves inflation. And since inflation is the rate of change of the price level, we can integrate this. And when we integrate this will give you a nominal interest rate that feeds back on the price level relative to its trend being given by the inflation rate. So the price level rule is going to feature the rule in this reparameterized form in terms of these alpha parameters is something that's going to appear again in the results. I could, any sort of questions?
Oh, just one from me, actually. So,
yeah, okay.
I guess my question is about, there's been a lot of literature in recent years about non-stationarity and natural rates of interest. So particularly the idea that natural rates have declined substantially over many decades, actually. And I was wondering how robust these rules you're considering are to this problem where R star itself is kind of moving around in a very non-stationary way over time.
Well, stationarity perhaps doesn't directly answer your question. DSG models by construction are stationary. And the data is not stationary, but we can stationarize the models and use the stationary version of the model to link it with the stationarized data. So everything is stationarized, the data and the model. Now we can, but this might perhaps answer you, we can allow the inflation target here to be a stochastic process. So we can actually deal with changes in the inflation target, which to some extent, it might respond to part of what you said. I don't know whether that will actually answer the substance of your question.
I think I'm concerned less about the ability to fit the past where you can filter data, I agree, to kind of make the world look stationary in line with the model. But I guess in terms of kind of the outlook going forwards, so it seems equally plausible to me over the next 10 years, we could have an increase in R star, kind of 200, 300 basis or 200 basis.
Yes.
And I kind of wonder whether a rule that do you need to take that into account?
Well, I think you're talking about sort of switch to different regimes, which actually, there's an interesting literature on Markov switching, which allows for switches to different regimes. I think that comes close to the sort of thing you might have in mind, or a close to something that would respond to your concerns, Markov switching regimes. I'm doing a bit of work on this, but this paper doesn't have any Markov switching. I suppose another thing is, and what about medium-term cycles? So I'm going to say something about that at the end, where we introduced so-called endogenous growth. And that's also work in progress. And that will have a big repercussion on optimized rules in the way that I'll discuss at the end.
I'll let you continue. Thanks.
Okay, so let me now talk. Okay, my pet subject now, I was talking about earlier, information assumptions. Now, when you put your model in Dino, I don't know how many people out there work in Dino, and you set up your model and you press all your buttons and you get your solution. What you get is a perfect information rational expectation solution, where it's imposed on the solution that agents observe all the current state variables. So every variable with a subscript T, if you like, in the model is observed by the agents. Now, this includes the exogenous processes, so that, for instance, if you have a total factor productivity shock or a preference shock or an inefficient shock, even if you have a measurement shock, you have a measurement error, which is itself a shock process, the assumption is it's observed directly by agents as an endowment. Now, this is a totally implausible assumption and becomes totally ridiculous when you have measurement errors too. So in general, you've got to consider a signal extraction problem for agents that don't have this perfect information advantage. They have imperfect information. They observe data. Let's say, for the sake of argument, they're using the model that's been estimated by the econometrician. So they're using the same data. If the data is lagged, then that's their information assumption. They only observe variables up with that lag. And then you have to solve this signal extraction problem of the agents, and you get a very different solution, rational expectation solution. Incidentally, it's a major reason why you should never use vars to validate. You should rarely use vars to validate a DSG model, because a DSG model will then not have a var representation. But that's almost another story. But it is a pet subject of mine, so I can never give a paper without rabbiting on about it. However, fortunately, we can retain the perfect information solution. That's the PI, perfect information, meaning agents can infer the structural shocks from their imperfect information set. So even though they don't directly observe the shocks, given their data, it's possible they can back out the shocks. And we call this agent invertibility or A invertibility. And our model, the model we use, has that feature. But if we make some changes to the data, it ceases to have that property. Again, as I said, rabbiting on about this, we have a recent paper that provides an A invertibility condition that generalizes the so-called poor man's invertibility condition of Fernandi Villaverde et al. This is the A, B, C, and D of vars. It's a lovely little paper. It's only a few pages. I think it's a very influential paper. I've never learned the reason why they call that invertibility condition a poor man's invertibility condition. If anybody would like to inform me on that, I'll be very grateful. Anyway, we've generalized this to allow for imperfect information. As I said, our model and the data and information assumptions means it is indeed A invertible. So we can press that perfect information button and be reassured that it gives the correct rational expectations solution, even though agents don't directly have perfect information. Now, in all the data we use, we're assuming that inflation and output are observed without a lag. In other words, current inflation and current output, the data is quarterly. So every quarter we've got good data for for current inflation rate and output. If we don't have this, we've got to replace 2, go back to 2, we've got to replace this with expectations of these variables, which is what this equation is. And then we've got to use an imperfect information solution to arrive at the best forecasts of these terms. Now, for those familiar with the Kalman filter, that's exactly what a Kalman filter does. The Kalman filter is at the heart of our imperfect information solution. That's something that, Joe and I did some, well, how many years ago now is it? So 50 odd years ago, we solved this problem. Okay, so that's a bit of history of economic thought. However, in this paper, we don't do this. And some early experiments show that if we observe data with a lag, it makes very little difference. Okay, so let me go on to talk about welfare optimal simple rules. Okay, I want to go back to here. These feedback parameters, the rho, the alpha y. So let's make this a vector of policy choices that the policymaker's got to choose, and it's going to choose in an optimal way. Now, we impose an important restriction that the class of possible rules are locally saddle path stable in the vicinity of the deterministic steady state. So we're going to solve a model about a deterministic steady state. And just to jump the gun a little bit, we're going to use a first and second order perturbation solution, which is available in Dinar. But an important restriction is that the rules are locally saddle path stable. They satisfy the so-called Blanchard-Kahn stability conditions, in other words. Okay, that's the restricted class of rules. Now let's talk about the welfare criterion. What we're going to do at time t equals 0, this should be t0, omega 0, we're going to maximize expected discounted sum of future utilities. And these terms come in because we have internal habit in our model. And this refers to hours supplied, and this is consumption. So this is a measure of household utility over time. Under conditions of uncertainty, we're taking expectations. And it can be written in the Bellman form, 5, where beta G is a growth-adjusted discount factor defined by this. So you can see if we, sigma, I should say, it's a risk aversion parameter. As this tends to 1, beta G goes back to the discount factor. And I should say beta is the discount factor, which lies between 0 and 1. So that's our welfare objective, a welfare criterion to rank the different rules and to choose what we mean by optimized rule.
Paul, if I could just interrupt you for a second. Martin Wheel has his hand up. And Martin, if I give you the kind of ability to ask this question yourself, let's see if this will work. Sorry. Why don't you continue and I'll see if I can work out how to do that. Apologies. Paul, you go ahead for now.
Okay. Okay, the welfare criterion. Okay, so at time t equals 0, we're going to maximize this intertemporal utility function. In general, the intertemporal utility, which we denote by omega, is going to depend on the steady state values of the rule. This is about which we perturb. This is the steady state values of the rule. Remember, a feature in the rule. So we have to pin down the steady state value of the rule of the interest rate, the instrument, Rn. We've got to choose the feedback parameters I've called rho. it depends upon the initial displacement. So the rule then in general will depend upon Z0, depending on where we start. Okay, this is at time t equals 0. Now, the steady state value of the nominal interest rate will be entirely, everything's pinned down by the choice of the steady state gross inflation rate, which is pi. So we can replace this with that. This is at time t equals 0. So what happens with the mere passage of time? Well, at time t, the initial displacement about the steady state, has now changed. So it seems here that at time t, we have a different optimization problem. And this is no more, no less than the time inconsistency problem. With the mere passage of time, the optimization problem changes through the change in ZT. So it follows that with simple rules, well, and indeed with optimal rules as well, but I'm not talking about optimal rules. With optimized simple rules, there's an incentive to re-optimize, to re-choose the rule, which is a function of the displacement at time t and the inflation rate at the steady state, whereas initially it was a function of the initial steady state and the inflation rate. So there's a time inconsistency problem. Now, we can remove one source of time inconsistency by choosing a welfare criteria, conditional on being at the steady state. So it's the welfare criterion when we reach the steady state. So it's a welfare that maximizes the steady state on average, about the steady state. Now, I should emphasize at this point, this contrasts with a non-stochastic problem that responds to a one-off displacement. You could think of policy in quite a different way. You could say, look, post-COVID, we have all these massive problems. We've just faced a massive supply-side shock with a massive problem for public finances. Ditto the financial crisis 2008. This is very much a one-off problem of getting back to normal. And wouldn't it be more appropriate to look at a non-stochastic problem? Yes, indeed it would, but this is not of that type. This is a problem that looks at the optimal policy and average in the vicinity of the steady state. If you like, it's more of a policy in normal times once we've got over these one-off shocks. And it follows a very influential paper by Schmidt, Grover, and Uribe. And what we've done here corresponds to what Woodford calls the timeless criterion. So what we're going to end up with is a rule that depends upon the steady state, but Z is independent of policy. But it does depend upon the inflation target. So it does depend on policy, but it's independent of the initial steady state, the initial settings apart from inflation. So Z here are the initial displacements of the shocks. You should think of that. So since this is independent of policy, we're down with a policy that depends simply on the choice of the inflation target, long-run inflation target. So there's still a credibility problem. This long-run inflation target has got to be credible in our setup. Well, I'm going to compute using a second-order perturbation solution. It's going to call a MATLAB subroutine to find a constrained maximum or minimum of the loss function. And I would say we have a toolkit available to do everything that you're going to see in the following slides. But as yet, there are no zero low bound considerations. Okay, can I go back to this bullet point and talk about the difference between this problem and the non-stochastic problem? And this problem is a maximization of the conditions of uncertainty. Non-stochastic problem is not. And you can think of this in terms of games that involve uncertainty and games that don't. Chess is a game of perfect foresight if you're clever enough. There's no uncertainty in chess. But I don't know how many people out there are familiar with the game of backgammon. It's a game I've just discovered recently, my grandchildren introduced it to me over the summer, and I've become intrigued with it. It's a game of chance, and I've shown you the board here. The idea is that each player starts off with 15 pieces, and the idea for the red is to go around in this direction. And eventually, when you get to the final quadrant, is to remove your pieces. White does the same. The important thing is you throw a couple of dice. So each time there are 21 possible combinations of these two dice, and that's the probability distribution that you face. High numbers and doubles are best. Doubles because you get twice the number of rules. And I won't go any further into the rules. If you have to fall on an empty spike, and if you fall on a spike with only one red with only one white, you can take off the white. So you're vulnerable if you're on a spike with only one piece. And I won't go into the details, but the important thing to emphasize is that this is a game of uncertainty, but there is an optimal strategy. Just like the optimal strategy I'm talking about for the policymaker at the steady state. So in principle, a clever player works out all the probabilities and works out an optimal strategy and knows the best rules. For instance, the rest beginning rule. So 3 and a 1 to start off with. You should take red there and one red there and one red there, which blocks that. So you know your best moves to start off with. You know your optimal strategy because you can work out the probabilities. So you're pretty close to knowing that. But of course, you won't win every time. You'll just win over playing hundreds of games. You'll win more often than not. And that's the analogy I like to make. Okay, let's get back to economics.
Paul, can I jump in and just...
You want to talk about backgammon, do you?
I actually apologize for the hiccup before, but I want to allow Martin to ask you a quick question. So this should now...
Okay.
Martin, can we hear you?
Yes, I just wanted to respond to the point that you made, David, about how you'd manage with a declining real interest rate. And I think the answer is that you would define your Taylor rule, not setting the level of the rate of interest with respect to inflation, but changing the rate of interest by a small amount whenever inflation wasn't on target. Now, provided you get the sign of that on and it's not too powerful, then in a simple rule, it will always deliver your target.
Okay, so you're actually talking about in the context of this framework, you're talking about a particular steady state path as opposed to a fixed steady state.
Yes, I'm saying that we don't know where the steady state real rate of interest is at the moment. So we can't aim for a fixed steady state, but we can set up a rule that will always bring inflation to its target.
Yes.
It's a bit of a deviation from what you've been talking about.
I think to some extent a time-varying inflation target, because the steady state inflation rate is pinned down by the steady state nominal interest rate is pinned down by the inflation rate. So I think to some extent it does. But okay, let me think about it, because I'm getting on actually. And I'm only halfway through. Okay. Let me talk about the three-stage delegation game, where I've talked about this. First of all, stage one, the policymaker chooses a per-period probability of hitting the zero-low bound. This could be a low probability. Stage two, the optimal steady-state inflation rate, consistent with one, is chosen. Stage three, the central bank, the independent central bank, receives the mandate in the form of a modified stochastic criterion of the form I've described and a rule of the form I described. That's one possibility. Or we can have a simple quadratic mandate rather than the full utility, which is really the main focus of the paper. And so one of the objectives is to see to what extent two can mimic one. So welfare is optimized with respect to the feedback parameters, resulting in an optimized rule. And as usual, this is a delegation game. You've got to work by backward induction. So I'm going to consider, first of all, one here and then two, and then present some results. Okay, I've got so let's start with stage 3, the central bank choice of rule. Okay, now the central bank then receives a mandate to implement the rule 2 to maximize with respect to the feedback rule. For the central bank, it's a modified welfare criteria where you modify the actual criterion with a penalty function, which will penalize, in this case, the standard deviation of the nominal interest rate. So the purpose of this is to enforce the zero lower bound by preventing the design of a rule that will hit the zero lower bound very frequently. Now, this is a symmetric case. There's also an asymmetric case, which I'll just bypass now. I'll just say for now, there's very little difference between these. So let's just focus on the symmetric case, because that's the appropriate case for the policies we have here. Okay, stage 2, both symmetric and asymmetric forms of the zero lower bound constraint result in the probability of hitting the zero lower bound, which is going to depend upon the steady state inflation rate and on the rule. Now, the rule itself would depend upon the penalty that you attach to, in this case, the variance of the nominal interest rate. In other words, a WR. Then given a low probability, which is part of the mandate, and given WR, we can then pin down the inflation rate that will achieve that zero lower bound. So what this does in effect, it shifts out the distribution of the nominal interest rate by increasing the steady state inflation rate. It makes room to achieve the zero lower bound by increasing the inflation steady state target. There's been lots of discussion whether this should be 2% or 4%, and part of the logic for the 4% is precisely to do this. So this then achieves the zero lower bound constraint with a high probability, with a low p bar and a high 1 minus p bar. Okay. So stage 1 then, we have to design the mandate. In the case of the zero lower bound mandate, so the mandate is simply the simply the choice of the weight that you pass on to the central bank, WR. In the case of the simple quadratic mandates, you have to add to this the weights in the quadratic mandate, which I'll come on to next. So for the zero lower bound mandate, where the loss function is the utility of the household, you're choosing at stage 1 a choice of the WR, the penalty weight, the rule, and the steady state inflation. And this then defines an equilibrium that's, if you follow the backward induction, it's a sub-K imperfect equilibrium. Okay, here are some graphs, and let me just I convert the welfare into consumption equivalent into a consumption equivalence. We define the welfare in terms of a 1% consumption equivalent is the change in welfare brought about by a permanent 1% change in consumption. I won't go over the mathematical details of that, but this is what we have here. And you can say here at stage 1, we have an optimal mandate here, which is at this red point here. And you can see as we increase WR, it brings down the inflation rate that you need in the steady state, brings down the standard deviation, and it also changes the feedback parameter alpha pi. So that gives you a glimpse of what's happening. There are some other graphs in the paper that you find useful. Okay, I'm not going to talk about consumption equivalence. I talk about welfare and target inflation. Now, let's first of all compare the welfare outcomes of the estimated versus the optimized rule, rules with and without the zero lower bound constraint, the welfare outcome of bad rules, such as the traditional Taylor rule as compared with the optimized rule. And what I'm going to compare everything with the optimized rule that has no zero lower bound constraint, so it's unconstrained, so that's zero. The consumption equivalent is zero. Everything is measured about that. The inflation, the gross inflation rate is zero at the steady state. And you can see here, in this case, we have a probability of hitting the zero lower bound of 0.3 per quarter. So it happens an awful lot. Whereas what we would like is to have a rule that hits at, say, 1% here, or possibly as much as 5%. So you can see here the consumption equivalent costs of imposing this zero lower bound. It's 5% for 1%, it's 0.05 of 1%, 0.02 of 2%. Of course, these numbers are rather low, but that is a feature of all this optimization, stabilization literature using DSG models, is that the gains from different types of optimized rules are rather small. However, the gain from an optimized rule itself is tremendous. If we take the original Taylor rule, which would be on the next slide, we have a 2% improvement in the consumption equivalent. Compared with the estimated rule, because we've replaced the estimated rule with the optimized rule, we have a significant consumption equivalence of 0.13 of 1%. And you can see the probability of hitting the zero lower bound is 0.06, as opposed to our targets of 1 or 5%. So let me, on this slide, I'm comparing the optimized simple rules. I'm ignoring the zero lower bound here. I mean, to some extent, this reproduces what we had before. And in the absence of a simple zero lower bound constraint, the thing is that the optimized feedback on the inflation rate is pretty enormous. You have extremely aggressive rules. And here we've not enforced the zero lower bound through the penalty function yet. This comes here. And here we've now enforced a zero lower bound through a penalty function. And you can see here now the equilibrium in terms of the parameter WR. And you can see how the optimized rules now, the feedback on inflation is far less aggressive because we have to impose a zero lower bound constraint. Hitting the zero lower bound, the probability of only 1%. And so these are the main results. And again, I suppose the main takeaway here is that the costs of imposing the zero lower bound are quite small. Imposing 5%, and this is compared with compared with zero, so it's 0.02 of 1% consumption equivalence. But then again, all the consumption equivalent differences are quite small. And then this is the optimized the price level rule, and you can see the takeaway here is that you have outcomes which are quite close to the full rule feeding back on inflation and output. So those are the two takeaways. The cost of imposing zero lower bound are small, and the cost of restricting yourself to a price level rule compared with the full rule is also small. You can see here, incidentally, the optimized rules are integral rules. Okay, let me, not left much time for the quadratic mandates. So let me just talk about them broadly. We're going to have 4 mandates. The idea of a mandate is to match the loss function with a particular simple rule. The idea is that the transparency of the loss function is going to be reinforced with that of the interest rate rule. And let me just look at the first mandate. The mandate 1, we have a net inflation target, and we have here now an extra feedback to design at stage 1. But you can see here this matching rule also feeds back on inflation and output growth. So that's the main idea there. The rule matches the simple rule. And then we go through all the apparatus. And again, in this case, we design as well as designing the parameter, the WR, we have to design a parameter that in the rule feeds back on the change in the growth. So the idea is a matching rule that matches the objective. And then we have inflation targeting with only two of these. The matching rule is a price level rule. The third one, I can go through these quite quickly because the main idea is we have a real wage growth rule and a matching simple rule. We have another rule, which is the employment growth rule. Again, we have a goal in terms of employment growth. HD is the demand for employment, and we have a matching rule. So that's the idea, an objective with a matching feedback rule. We go through everything I've just said before, and in this case, we have a grid in both WR and WDY in that case, and I'll just summarize the results at the end. The price level rule, there's only there's only a feedback on there's only a weight on the nominal interest rate variance to worry about. Then there's a real wage mandate. And this is a summary of the results. I think I've got I've just got a few minutes left. I've got just enough I've got two summary things. If am I going to be cut off at 1 hour exactly?
Yeah, Paul, I was wondering if you want to just take a couple of questions at this point.
Well, should I go over the summary first? I've just got two summary slides. And the bottom line is that the weights attached to real economic activities are between 0.2 and 1. And this some support for a dual mandate, that is inflation and real target mandate, but our weights are rather smaller than those found in a comparable study. The source of this lies in some important differences in the model, and also the fact that everything we've done is couched in terms of simple rules, whereas they do it in terms of a Ramsey rule and a quadratic approximation of the loss function. However, in mandate 3, we do get closer to a dual mandate that emphasizes the real objectives and the conclusions. And it's a novel, easy to implement framework, simple goal rules plus matching rules, some limited support for a dual mandate, but more limited. The price level rule closely mimics the alternatives. Just three things that we're working on is the fiscal dimension, which will place a constraint on exceeding a long-run debt-to-income ratio target, macroprudential regulation, which introduce loan-to-value targets and a low probability of exceeding those. And finally, we can introduce a real friction that's not the Kimball aggregator, which doesn't work well, using hysteresis or endogenous technical change. And that's, well, actually, I'm exactly on. I've got 1 minute to go, but you want to field some questions? We're going to continue for a few minutes.
Yeah, we've probably got time just for a couple of questions. So I'll pass one to you from my colleague Gulcin Ozkan. So she asks, it's a similar question to the one I asked you about, where we have regime switches in the long-run inflation rate. So I guess, we've had a lot of fluctuations in the inflation rates in the time series. Are you treating these as, how should one model those? Are they regime switches or something different? Let me give you, I'll pose a question myself as well, and then maybe you can take both of them. So I'd just be interested, given the framework you've set out, we've seen the Fed move from something that looked more like an inflation targeting policy rule to a framework that's based on average inflation targeting. I was wondering if you could kind of just comment on that move through the lens of your model. Is that something that kind of makes sense as a strategy? Is it a superior strategy given the framework you've set out? Thank you.
Well, in principle, one can look at a whole range of different rules. I'm not quite sure what you mean by average inflation targeting. Do you mean what they, if we go back to what I wrote, the makeup strategies. I talk about makeup strategies. Well, makeup strategies are just simply rules with persistence. There's an awful lot of huffing and puffing about this. But I mean, there are some differences. I mean, you can frame the rules in different ways. And this is a framework that will usefully look at different rules and compare their outcome, rank the rules in terms of the welfare outcomes. So it's a very appropriate framework, I think, for addressing precisely that concern. Different rules. And then regime switching. Well, the nearest thing I get to it is making inflation targets stochastic, an AR1 process for the inflation, the gross inflation target. But in principle, one can use Markov switching, which is all actually available in Dyno. It is something. I mean, if you want a PhD student who, for some reason, likes this framework, Markov switching would be a very, I think, useful extension and implementation of this framework. So I think it can be used for Markov switching between regimes. You have to be a bit careful about shocks and targets. You have to be very careful about information. You have to take very seriously everything I said about information.
That's a message we'll take away. This is it's been a great seminar, Paul. Thank you very much indeed for your time and for setting out what looks like a really rich framework, and the kind of avenues you intend to kind of build in also look super interesting. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of everyone in the audience.
Okay. Okay, thanks for listening. And let me leave you with the backgammon slide.
We'll have some new fans of
it's an advert for backgammon, really.
All right, let's end it here. I think we're meeting again in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Are you going to send me an email?
Yeah,
we'll talk. Okay, it's been lovely going to the Kings.
Yeah.
I'd really like to see you face to face sometime, and perhaps in the future.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.